Hi guys, today we're going to go through fiscal policy and everything that you need to know about fiscal policy. So, when talking about fiscal policy, we have to remember that it's a way for the government to influence the state of the economy through varying government spending and interest rates. And with fiscal policy, we have two types of fiscal policy: expansionary and contractionary. Expansionary fiscal policy is where we want to increase the GDP of the economy, but you have to remember that inflation is also going to increase. And contractionary fiscal policy, well, the main aim there is to reduce inflation. And at the same time, GDP will also be reduced. We have to also remember, as it is a demand side policy, it's going to affect aggregate demand. And you have to remember the equation: aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M, where C is consumption, I is investment, G is net government spending, X is exports, and M is imports. That's the diagram there, which shows you if we were to have expansionary fiscal policy, we're moving aggregate demand out to the right, which would cause GDP to increase and inflation to also increase. Whereas contractionary would move aggregate demand to the left, which would cause GDP to decrease, but your aim is inflation would also decrease. When looking at expansionary fiscal policy, like we said, the aim is to increase GDP, but inflation will also increase. Let's have a look at how this happens. So, government spending would increase, maybe because they're building schools or hospitals or roads. And as they build these things, they demand resources for these activities, whether they're demanding bricks or windows or doors or tables or chairs. So, therefore, aggregate demand will increase and GDP will increase. But the negative part is inflation will also increase. Another way that they can have expansionary fiscal policy is through reducing taxes, such as income tax or corporation tax and other taxes. If they reduce taxes, let's say, for example, income tax, people would have more disposable income. And if they have more disposable income, they have more money to spend. By having more money to spend, consumption should increase in theory, which means aggregate demand will increase, GDP will increase, and inflation would also increase. So it's the same diagram, but this time looking at the impact of taxes. And if we were to look at contractionary fiscal policy, well, like we said, the aim is to reduce inflation, but also negatively, GDP will reduce. And by doing this, we can have a look at both examples. So if the government reduces spending, so they're building less schools and roads and hospitals and so on, that means that they're going to demand fewer resources. By demanding fewer resources because they don't have as many things to build or supply, that means aggregate demand will decrease, and therefore inflation will decrease and GDP will also decrease. The other way is by increasing taxation. So, if they were to increase income tax or corporation tax, people would have less disposable income because more of it is being taxed. And that means consumption will decrease, aggregate demand will decrease, inflation will decrease, and therefore GDP will decrease. For example, if we were to look at the impact on a company, if there is more corporation tax, that means companies have less money to reinvest. And by reinvesting, that means buying more supplies and so on. So if they have less, they can buy less resources. Aggregate demand will decrease because the demand for resources has decreased. So again, the same argument that inflation would decrease, but GDP will also decrease. And now looking at the evaluation, this is really, really important. So you have one side of the tail, which would be crowding out, where government investment will crowd out private companies in the long run. And what this means is if government companies are bidding on contracts, their main aim is not profit. So by doing so, they would get the private contracts, which means that a lot of private businesses would shut down in the long run. And they would shut down because they don't have any money coming in from winning these contracts. Now, when government spending eventually decreases because they can't continue spending at that rate, you have a lot of private companies that had shut down, where a lot of people have become unemployed. Now, when they had shut down, there is no more private business in the economy. The opposite of that is crowding in. And some economists believe that government spending would actually encourage private employment and businesses as well. So when the government spends more, let's say they're building schools or roads or hospitals, they are going to demand workers to do this. Now, by paying those workers, people have an income which they may not have had otherwise. If they were to have this income, they're going to go and spend it either in a restaurant or a shop or at the hairdressers, which could be a private business. Now, that private business has seen a certain increase in their demand, so they employ more people to help with this. And those people, again, in turn, spend their income and would help uh, spend that money at other private businesses. This means there are more employment opportunities in the private sector, and eventually, because of the increase in employment in the private sector, that means that when the government eventually do stop spending money, the private sector can help sustain any demand and can help increase the growth rate of the economy. The second thing is how much. Well, it depends how much taxes are being increased or how much government spending is being reduced. Because if taxes are going from 65% to 66%, that's not a large jump. Whereas if they're going from 30% to 60%, that's massively going to affect people. So it really depends on how much taxes are going to be increased or government spending is going to be reduced or increased as well. And we also have time. Well, if they give you notice that, we're going to spend £1 billion over the next 20 years, that would have far less of an effect compared to if we're going to spend £1 billion this year. And lastly, it's other policy clashes. So, for example, if the government is trying to use expansionary fiscal policy, this may clash with other policies such as monetary policy, which we will also look at in another video. For example, if they had expansionary fiscal policy, but at the same time the central bank was using contractionary monetary policy, these policies could clash and it may cancel out depending on the effect. And there you have it. That's everything that you need to know for fiscal policy, including the evaluation marks. And the way that I've laid out the arguments is exactly what you need as your analysis. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content as well, and leave a comment if there are any particular parts that you didn't understand.